Society is fine with you surviving, but it fears you becoming free through wealth. From the very beginning of our lives, society has a blueprint already waiting for us. You're born, you go to school, you learn how to memorize, how to follow instructions, how to show up on time, and how to keep quiet until it's your turn to speak. You're taught how to pass exams, how to get the right grades, and eventually how to apply for a job. That's the formula. That's the path society lays out like a conveyor belt, moving millions of people along the same direction with very little deviation. The truth is, this design doesn't reward thinking differently. It rewards compliance. It doesn't reward courage. It rewards safety. It doesn't encourage you to stand out. It urges you to blend in. That's why I say society loves average. Now, what do I mean by average? Average is simply the middle ground, the place where most people live because it feels safe, accepted, and predictable. Average is going to school, getting a job, earning just enough to survive, and then doing it all over again until retirement. Average is waiting until you're 65 to finally have the freedom you should have been building since 25, but let's face it, when you're living average, you're not really living on your own terms. You're living on terms society created for you. Think about it. The very system of education most of us go through doesn't spend much time teaching about money, investing, ownership, or freedom. It teaches you how to be a good employee, not how to be a wealthy individual. You're told, go get good grades so you can get a good job. But has anyone ever stopped to say, go build assets so you can create freedom? Not often. Why? Because society thrives when you remain average, when you take the predictable path, and when you don't question the script. Look around. Those who break out of average thinking are often criticized or judged. The entrepreneur who drops out of college to chase an idea is called reckless. The dreamer who refuses to take a secure job and instead pursues business ownership is told they're irresponsible. Yet these are the very people who often end up creating extraordinary wealth and freedom, but before they succeed, they're usually surrounded by voices urging them to be realistic. Realistic is another word for average. Average living is comfortable, but it's also dangerous because comfort makes you forget the cost of wasted potential. When you accept average, you trade the possibility of greatness for the guarantee of mediocrity. Society loves that trade because when you stay in the middle, you never disrupt the system. You remain predictable, manageable, and ordinary. Society has always had a strange relationship with people who rise above the ordinary. On one hand, they admire success stories, they celebrate winners after the fact, and they put wealthy individuals on magazine covers once they've already proven themselves. But before that success becomes undeniable, those same people are often doubted, mocked, or even resisted. Why? Because society fears the extraordinary. It fears what doesn't fit into the mold, what can't be explained by the same rules everyone else is following. When you set out to get rich, to build freedom, or to live life on your own terms, you are no longer playing by the same set of rules the majority is comfortable with. You're no longer clocking in, waiting for payday, or hoping for a raise. Instead, you begin to think about ownership, leverage, investments, and creating opportunities instead of waiting for them. To the average person, that kind of thinking feels foreign. It feels risky. It feels unrealistic. And because they don't understand it, they label it as dangerous. Consider how society treats innovators or entrepreneurs in their early stages. A young person quits a secure job to start a business. Immediately, the chorus of voices chimes in, "That's too risky. What if it doesn't work? Why not play it safe?" They don't ask, what if it succeeds? What if this idea changes everything? Because the extraordinary mindset is outside their comfort zone, they see it as a threat. Society is built on stability, predictability, and control. Extraordinary individuals disrupt that. Think about the way wealth itself is perceived. For most people, money equals security, paying the bills, covering expenses, maybe saving a little, but for those seeking extraordinary wealth, money equals freedom, growth, and impact. That's a completely different mindset. It means you're not content with surviving, you're aiming to thrive. That alone makes others uncomfortable. It reminds them of what they could be doing but aren't, and instead of being inspired, many choose to criticize. The truth is, society doesn't teach the rules of the extraordinary because if everyone learned them, the system would no longer function as it does. If too many people became financially independent, who would work the jobs that keep the machine running? That's why extraordinary ambition is often discouraged, disguised as concern, realism, or advice. It's not that society truly cares about your safety, it cares about maintaining its balance. The extraordinary forces people to question their own choices, their own comfort, and their own excuses. That's why it's resisted, feared, and even attacked, not because it's wrong, but because it's rare. And rarity always unsettles the crowd. One of the cleverest ways society keeps people from reaching true wealth is through the system of debt. From the very start of adulthood, you're introduced to it almost like a rite of passage. At 18, credit card offers start showing up in the mail. Student loans are not just encouraged, they're practically celebrated. Congratulations, you've been approved for thousands of dollars in loans. And without even realizing it, most people are stepping into a trap that will shape the rest of their financial lives. Debt is not just about money, it's about control. When you owe, you're not free. Debt ties you down to obligations, to payments, to interest rates, and ultimately to someone else's terms. It forces you into jobs you may not like, hours you don't control, and routines you can't escape. You don't get to make decisions based on vision. You make them based on survival. That's the hidden power of debt. It convinces you that you're living well while keeping you chained to a system that profits from your lack of freedom. Think about how society positions debt. The moment you graduate, they tell you to finance a car, to take on a mortgage you can barely afford, to get the newest phone on monthly payments. They call it normal. They even call it responsible. But here's the truth: the more payments you carry, the fewer choices you have. When the bills are stacked high, you can't take risks, you can't invest, and you certainly can't step away from your paycheck for very long. That's exactly how the system prefers it: predictable, obedient, dependent. Now contrast that with how little society teaches about assets, ownership, and investment. Very few schools teach how money actually grows, how interest works in your favor instead of against you, or how to build cash, flowing assets. But almost every young person can tell you how to apply for a loan. Doesn't that seem intentional? If you're educated in borrowing but not in building, you'll spend your life paying instead of earning. The truth is, debt isn't just financial, it's psychological. When you're buried under payments, your vision for the future shrinks. You don't dream about building wealth, you dream about paying things off. You don't think about freedom, you think about getting through the month. Debt convinces you that just keeping up is enough, and that mindset quietly robs you of ambition. And that's the point: as long as you're controlled by debt, you're controlled by the very system that benefits from keeping you average. Debt keeps you busy, keeps you distracted, and keeps you from ever stepping into the kind of independence that wealth requires. In the past, control was about physical limits. People were confined by geography, by lack of access to resources, or by systems that openly restricted opportunity. But today, control looks different. It doesn't come with chains or walls. It comes through screens, entertainment, and endless noise. Distraction has quietly become the new prison, and most people don't even realize they're locked inside. Think about how much of society's design is centered on keeping your attention occupied. The average person spends hours scrolling through social media, hours watching shows, hours chasing headlines that don't change their life in the slightest. There's always something new: new drama, new gossip, new notifications. And yet, with all this activity, there's very little progress. That's the irony of distraction. It feels busy, but it produces nothing. Wealth, on the other hand, requires focus. It requires long stretches of effort aimed at building, creating, and multiplying. It demands that you give your attention to things that grow instead of things that fade. But society doesn't hand you focus. It hands you entertainment. The platforms are free because you are the product. Your attention is sold, your habits are shaped, and your ambition is quietly drained one scroll at a time. Distraction is powerful because it doesn't look like a trap. It looks like fun, like relaxation, like connection, but the cost is hidden. Every hour lost to meaningless distraction is an hour not invested in learning, building, or creating. Over years, that adds up to an entire life spent consuming what others produce instead of producing for yourself. That's why distraction is so dangerous. It steals your potential without you noticing. And the system thrives on it. The more distracted you are, the less you question, the less you challenge, and the less you build. A distracted population is an obedient population because they're too busy chasing the next trend to notice what they're missing. The prison doors are wide open, but most people never step out because they don't even know they're inside. If you look closely, the wealthiest people in the world are not the most entertained. They're the most focused. They use technology, but they don't let it use them. They consume, but only what adds value to their vision. They're not prisoners of distraction, they're masters of attention. And that's the difference society doesn't want you to see. When you begin the journey toward wealth, you're not just chasing money, you're breaking a pattern that has been in place for generations. Most families are caught in the cycle of working to survive, earning just enough to cover expenses, and passing down the same habits to their children. This cycle is so common, so ingrained, that society treats it as normal, but real wealth disrupts that cycle. It changes the script, and disruption is something the system resists. Wealth means independence. It means you don't need to wait for payday to make decisions. You don't need permission to take a trip, to start a project, or to walk away from an environment that doesn't serve you. That kind of independence challenges the very structure that society depends on. If enough people gained true financial freedom, they wouldn't accept low-paying jobs, they wouldn't buy into unnecessary consumer debt, and they wouldn't tolerate being controlled by fear. That's why society quietly discourages wealth. It needs people to stay in the pattern, to keep the machine running. Now think about the shift that happens when one person in a family chooses a different path. The child who studies investing instead of only chasing grades, the young professional who builds assets instead of piling up debt, the entrepreneur who starts a business instead of waiting for a promotion. Each of these choices has the power to break a generational cycle. Suddenly, future children don't inherit just bills and survival habits. They inherit knowledge, assets, and a new vision of what life can look like. That's the true power of wealth. It multiplies beyond the individual, and it rewrites the future for everyone connected to them. And yet, when you decide to pursue this path, don't be surprised if you encounter resistance. Friends, family, even coworkers may question your choices, not because they hate you, but because your decision to step outside the pattern makes them uncomfortable with their own choices. When you show that another way is possible, it forces them to reflect on what they've accepted. That's why wealth often attracts criticism before it attracts admiration. Real wealth isn't just about numbers in a bank account. It's about freedom of time, freedom of choice, and freedom of direction. It's about living life by design instead of default. And when you step into that reality, you show the world that the old pattern is not the only option. You become living proof that ordinary beginnings don't have to lead to average endings, and proof is powerful, because once someone sees it can be done, they can never again say it's impossible. Society has its way of shaping us, teaching us to be average, warning us against the extraordinary, trapping us in debt, drowning us in distraction, and resisting anyone who dares to break the cycle. But the truth is, wealth was never meant for the obedient, it was meant for the bold. The ones who step away from comfort, who challenge the rules, who refuse to be chained by the expectations of the crowd. Real wealth is not just about money, it's about freedom, independence, and the ability to write your own story. And while society may not want you to get rich, it doesn't get to decide your future. That decision belongs only to you.